The Quran. 1. Was the Quran directly revealed by God or chosen by man? 2. Has the Quran been perfectly preserved or has it changed over the centuries? Torpedo 1. Eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony. The standard Islamic narrative claims that the Quran was revealed to Muhammad from AD 610 to AD 632. These claims are based on sources with three major problems. Problem number 1. These sources were written 200 to 300 years after the events they describe. This is too late to represent eyewitness testimony. On the diagram below, we see the various Islamic sources arranged on a timeline. We see the Sirah, or the biography of Muhammad, the Hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, the Tafsir, the commentaries on the Quran, and the Tariq, the histories of mankind. As the diagram shows, according to the Sin, Muhammad died in 632. But the first recognized biography was written by a man who died in 833, that's Ibn Hisham. 833 is just over 200 years after the death of Muhammad. The first recognized hadith collection was written by a man who died in 870, that's al-Bukhari. 870 is nearly 240 years after the death of Muhammad. And the Tafsir and Tariq were written by al-Tabari, who died in 923, which is just over 300 years after the death of Muhammad. So these sources are 200 to 300 years later. They could not have been eyewitnesses. Problem number 2. These sources were written by men who were from places like Cairo in Egypt, Tabaristan in Iran, and Bukhara in Uzbekistan. They also did most of their writing in Baghdad. This is nearly 1,800 kilometers away from Mecca and Medina. So not only were they too late, they were too far away. They could not have been eyewitnesses. Problem number 3 means that if we are going to be truly evidence-based, we can only go by the manuscript evidence. This means that we have to examine the earliest manuscripts for these sources. Now, it's bad enough that the standard Islamic narrative dates for the sources are 200 to 300 years after Muhammad's death. The earliest manuscripts we have for these collections are even later. They range from 400 to 800 years after the death of Muhammad. As we can see from the diagram, for the Hadith, the manuscripts are from the 11th to the 15th centuries. For the Sirah, they're also from the 11th to the 15th centuries, and the Tafsir and Tariq are from the 11th to the 15th centuries. That's 400 to 800 years after the death of Muhammad. So, we do not have any eyewitness testimony. Torpedo 1 scores a direct hit. The Muslim response: Arabic whispers or Muslim telephones. When confronted by this 300-year gap, Muslims claim that we can accept the standard Islamic narrative because the information has been handed down unchanged by a process of oral tradition. They claim that the memories of the first Muslims were good enough to preserve the facts without change. And they cite the fact that people today can memorize the Quran from childhood as evidence for this. However, modern memory science does not support the standard Islamic narrative. It shows that memory degrades very rapidly so that 75% of what is heard is forgotten within 1 week. That's why good teachers do lots of revision with their students. And the only reason that people today can memorize the Quran is because they have something written down to memorize. Also, anthropological studies of cultures that actually use oral tradition don't support the sin. They show that while oral tradition can transfer information, it's not word for word. And each time the story is retold, it changes, just like a singer does not perform exactly the same way each time they perform. Therefore, much variation is possible. Just think of the children's game Chinese Whispers or the telephone game, where the whole message can change in just a few minutes of oral transmission. If this can happen in a few minutes of oral transmission, imagine what happens over 250 years of oral transmission. Finally, the standard Islamic narrative says that the whole reason for the first edition of the Quran was that too many of those who had memorized the Quran had been killed in a battle. The sources confirm that they feared that parts of the Quran would be lost, so they had to write it down. So even the Sin confirms that oral transmission is not reliable for the preservation of the Quran. What's the bottom line? There is no eyewitness testimony to the revelation of the Quran. Torpedo 1 scores a direct hit.